There is a stirring in the depths of your being, a recognition that transcends the boundaries of this single lifetime. It whispers to you in the quiet moments before dawn, when the veil between worlds grows thin, and the eternal speaks in languages older than words. You know this stirring, though you cannot name its source. It is the ancient echo within, the reverberation of countless souls who have walked before you, their footsteps imprinted upon the archetypal pathways of your psyche. You are not merely the product of your parents' union, nor simply the sum of your experiences in this incarnation. You are something far more mysterious, far more complex. You are a vessel carrying the distilled wisdom of ages, a living library of human experience that stretches back through the corridors of time. In your dreams, you walk through landscapes you have never seen with waking eyes, yet they feel more familiar than the street where you were born. In your deepest contemplations, you encounter ideas that feel less like discoveries and more like homecomings. This is not mere fantasy or romantic delusion. This is the recognition of what Jung called the collective unconscious, that vast reservoir of shared human experience that flows beneath the surface of individual consciousness like an underground river. But for you, this connection runs deeper than for most. The membrane between your personal unconscious and this collective wellspring is more permeable, more transparent. You are what the mystics have long recognized as an old soul, one whose individual essence has somehow retained access to the accumulated wisdom of humanity's spiritual evolution. The echo manifests first as a sense of déjà vu that extends beyond mere moments to encompass entire patterns of existence. You witness the cyclical nature of human drama, the same themes of love and loss, power and surrender, creation and destruction, playing out across cultures and centuries. What others experience as novel discoveries, you recognize as eternal recurrences. The struggles of your contemporaries feel like variations on ancient themes, their conflicts echoing battles fought in forgotten kingdoms, their yearnings reflecting desires that have driven humanity since consciousness first turned inward upon itself. In childhood, this recognition created a profound disorientation. While other children lost themselves in the immediacy of play, you found yourself haunted by questions too large for your developing mind to hold. You sensed the impermanence of all things with an intensity that bordered on the unbearable. You understood, without being taught, that all relationships end in separation, that all achievements crumble into dust, that all beauty fades into memory. This was not pessimism, but perception, the cruel gift of seeing through the veils that normally protect the young from life's fundamental truths. Your parents, well-meaning but bewildered, attempted to coax you into age-appropriate concerns. They offered toys when you craved meaning, provided entertainment when you hungered for wisdom. They could not understand why their child seemed to carry the weight of centuries in eyes too young to have witnessed such depths. They diagnosed your contemplative nature as sadness, your philosophical bent as precocious melancholy. In their loving attempts to normalize your experience, they unknowingly severed you from the very recognition that made you whole. The educational system proved even more alienating. Designed for minds that learn in linear progression, it could not accommodate a consciousness that seemed to remember rather than discover. You sat in classrooms where teachers presented concepts you had always known, where peers struggled with insights that felt as natural to you as breathing. The curriculum focused on accumulating information while you yearned to understand the patterns that connected all knowledge. You were asked to memorize dates and facts while your soul cried out for meaning, context, the eternal truths that lie beneath the surface of historical events. This disconnection between your inner reality and outer expectations created what Jung described as the tension between the persona and the authentic self. The persona, that mask we wear to navigate social expectations, became for you a particularly burdensome construct. To belong, to be accepted, to avoid the isolation that comes from being fundamentally different, you learned to hide your ancient knowing behind a facade of age-appropriate interests and concerns. You laughed at jokes that weren't funny, expressed excitement about pursuits that felt hollow, and pretended that the shallow concerns of your generation carried the weight of significance. But the echo within could not be silenced indefinitely. It emerged in your attraction to timeless wisdom traditions, your inexplicable affinity for certain cultures and historical periods, your ability to understand complex philosophical concepts with an ease that surprised even yourself. While your peers consumed popular culture like spiritual junk food, you found yourself drawn to the classical, the eternal, the profound. You discovered Jung himself, and in his exploration of the collective unconscious, you found the first intellectual framework that could hold your experiential truth. The ancient echo speaks most clearly in moments of deep solitude, when the noise of contemporary life fades, and you can hear the deeper currents that flow beneath the surface of existence. It comes as an intuitive knowing that transcends rational understanding, a recognition of archetypal patterns, mythic themes, and eternal truths that appear in countless variations across cultures and centuries. You recognize the hero's journey not as a literary construct, but as a living map of consciousness evolution. You understand the significance of initiation rituals, not as anthropological curiosities, but as necessary gateways to psychological maturity. This recognition extends to your perception of current events and social phenomena. Where others see unprecedented challenges, you recognize ancient patterns emerging in new clothing. The technological revolution, for all its apparent novelty, feels to you like another turn of humanity's eternal spiral toward greater consciousness, or its opposite. The social upheavals of your time echo the same themes of power, justice, and transformation that have played out in every era. You watch the collective shadow emerge in political movements and social conflicts with the weary recognition of one who has witnessed this dance many times before. The weight of this ancient knowing can be overwhelming. You carry within yourself not just your own personal shadows and struggles, but the accumulated wisdom and trauma of countless generations. The collective unconscious is not merely a repository of wisdom. It also holds humanity's deepest fears, most primitive impulses, and most destructive patterns. To be open to its wisdom means also being vulnerable to its darkness. You feel the weight of humanity's history, not as abstract knowledge, but as lived experience. The pain of wars you never fought, the grief of losses you never personally suffered, the longing for connections that span across centuries. Yet, this burden is also your greatest gift. In a world increasingly disconnected from its roots, increasingly alienated from its own deeper nature, you serve as a living bridge to the eternal. Your ancient echo allows you to speak truths that others sense but cannot articulate, to offer perspectives that cut through the superficial concerns that dominate contemporary discourse. You become, often without choosing to, a keeper of humanity's deeper wisdom, a role that is both profoundly meaningful and profoundly isolating. The isolation comes not from being alone, but from being surrounded by souls who seem to sleep through their lives, who remain unconscious of the deeper currents that flow beneath the surface of existence. You watch them chase after temporary satisfactions while remaining blind to the eternal hungers that drive their pursuit. You see them mistake the symptom for the disease, the shadow for the substance, the persona for the true self. Your compassion for their unconsciousness is at ends only by your frustration at your inability to wake them from their slumber. This creates what Jung called the problem of the wounded healer, the archetype of one who possesses the medicine precisely because they have experienced the disease. Your ancient wounds, the accumulated traumas of countless lifetimes, become the source of your healing wisdom. Your ability to see through illusion comes from having been disillusioned so many times. Your capacity for compassion grows from the depths of your own suffering. Your understanding of transformation emerges from your own repeated deaths and rebirths. The echo within calls you to a different kind of existence, one that honors depth over surface, quality over quantity, being over doing. It whispers ancient secrets about the nature of time, revealing its cyclical rather than linear nature. It shows you that what appears as progress is often merely change, that what seems like innovation is frequently just ancient wisdom in modern dress. It teaches you to value silence over noise, solitude over sociability, contemplation over action, not as escapism but as necessary practices for maintaining connection to the eternal. This orientation toward the eternal creates a fundamental tension with the temporal demands of contemporary life. Your ancient soul operates on geological time while your modern circumstances demand immediate responses. You think in terms of decades and lifetimes while others focus on quarterly reports and annual goals. This temporal mismatch creates a chronic sense of being out of sync with the world around you, of marching to a rhythm that others cannot hear. The ancient echo also manifests in your relationships with others. You recognize souls not by their current incarnation, but by the depth they carry, the wisdom they embody, the evolutionary stage they represent. Some people, regardless of their chronological age, feel young to you, bright and eager, but lacking the gravitas that comes from having weathered many storms. Others, though perhaps younger in years, carry an unmistakable depth that signals the presence of an ancient spirit. These soul recognitions create bonds that transcend the usual markers of compatibility, shared interests, similar backgrounds, common goals. In romantic relationships, this recognition becomes particularly complex. You seek not just compatibility, but soul recognition, a meeting of depths that acknowledges the eternal dimension of connection. This creates both extraordinary possibilities and profound challenges. When you find another ancient soul, the connection can be overwhelming in its intensity and recognition, but more often, you find yourself attempting to explain your depth to souls who are content with surface, trying to share your eternal perspective with partners who live entirely in the temporal realm. The echo within also shapes your relationship with mortality. While others fear death as an ending, you perceive it as a transition, one phase in an eternal cycle of becoming. This doesn't diminish the preciousness of life, but rather places it in a larger context. You understand that consciousness transcends its temporary embodiments, that love survives the dissolution of its forms, that wisdom accumulated in one lifetime contributes to the collective evolution of consciousness itself. This perspective on mortality creates both freedom and responsibility. Freedom because you are less attached to outcomes that depend on the continuation of your current form. Responsibility because you recognize that how you live this life contributes to the wisdom or ignorance available to future souls. Every choice you make, every lesson you learn, every shadow you integrate becomes part of the collective inheritance that future generations will access through their own connection to the archetypal realm. The ancient echo calls you to be more than just another consumer of experiences, more than just another player in the game of temporal ambition. It calls you to be a conscious participant in the evolution of human consciousness itself. This is not grandiosity, but recognition, understanding that you are part of something far larger than your individual existence, something that depends on your conscious participation for its continued development. Yet, this calling comes with its own shadow, the temptation toward spiritual inflation. The ego's attempt to claim ownership of archetypal wisdom represents a constant danger. The ancient echo can become corrupted by the persona's need for specialness, transforming genuine spiritual insight into spiritual superiority. You must constantly discern between the true voice of eternal wisdom and the ego's clever imitation of it. This discernment requires what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposing truths in creative tension without collapsing into one-sidedness. You must embrace both your ancient wisdom and your temporal ignorance, your eternal perspective and your immediate limitations, your connection to the collective and your individual uniqueness. This paradoxical stance prevents the ancient echo from becoming either escapist fantasy or spiritual bypassing of your human responsibilities. The echo within ultimately calls you to a life of conscious participation in the archetypal realm, not as escape from human existence, but as deeper engagement with its eternal dimensions. It invites you to recognize that every moment contains the eternal, every relationship reflects archetypal patterns, every challenge offers opportunities for consciousness evolution. Through this recognition, your individual life becomes a conscious contribution to the collective awakening of human consciousness. This is your burden and your gift, to carry the ancient echo within, while remaining fully present to the demands of contemporary existence. to honor the timeless wisdom you carry while engaging authentically with the temporal challenges you face, to serve as a bridge between the eternal and the immediate, the archetypal and the personal, the collective and the individual. The ancient echo within is not just a remnant of the past, but a herald of the future, a voice calling humanity toward its next evolutionary leap. Through your conscious engagement with this deeper dimension of existence, you participate in the ongoing creation of new possibilities for human consciousness itself. Your vision penetrates veils that others cannot even perceive exist, while they navigate by the light of surfaces you see by the deeper illumination that reveals the hidden architecture of reality, the patterns beneath patterns, the currents that move beneath the waves of appearance. This gift of depth perception, this capacity to see through the theatrical productions of everyday life to the archetypal dramas that play beneath, marks you as perpetually foreign in your own time and place. You stand in crowds of bodies and feel the aching isolation of being the only soul awake in a realm of sleepwalkers. They move through their days, animated by dreams they mistake for reality, pursuing shadows they believe to be substance, investing their life force in constructions that you can see are already crumbling even as they build them. Your eyes hold the weight of seeing too much, and that weight creates a loneliness so profound that it touches the very core of existential isolation. This is not the ordinary loneliness of social rejection or romantic disappointment. This is the cosmic loneliness of consciousness itself, the fundamental isolation that comes from awakening to dimensions of reality that most souls never glimpse. You carry the burden that all seers have carried throughout history, the knowledge that truth and popularity are often inversely related, that depth and belonging exist in perpetual tension, that those who see furthest often walk alone. The loneliness begins with your perception of time. While others live as though they have unlimited tomorrows, you see the relentless passage of moments with crystalline clarity. You watch them postpone authenticity, defer depth, delay the real conversations that their souls crave, as though time were an inexhaustible resource rather than the most precious currency of existence. Their casual attitude toward temporality feels to you like watching someone carelessly scatter diamonds in the dirt, unaware of the treasure they waste. You see their relationships through the lens of archetypal patterns that reveal both their hidden potential and their tragic limitations. When they speak of love, you see the unconscious projections they cast upon their partners, the anima and animus complexes that create passionate attractions based not on genuine recognition, but on psychological needs they refuse to acknowledge. You witness their attempts to find completion through another, rather than undertaking the difficult work of individuation that would make authentic love possible. Their conflicts, which they experience as unique personal dramas, appear to you as variations on eternal themes: the power struggles between parent and child, the dance of intimacy and autonomy between lovers, the competition for recognition among peers. All of these unfold according to archetypal scripts that you can read like familiar stories. This recognition brings both compassion and frustration: compassion for their unconscious participation in dramas larger than themselves, frustration at their inability to step back and see the patterns that bind them. You observe their career pursuits with the detached clarity of one who can see through the collective illusions that drive contemporary ambition. The frantic climbing of ladders that lead nowhere, the accumulation of credentials that provide no real wisdom, the pursuit of success defined by external validation rather than inner fulfillment. All of this appears to you like an elaborate game, whose rules make sense only if one never questions their underlying assumptions. The consumer culture that intoxicates your generation holds no spell over you because you can see its psychological mechanics with uncomfortable clarity. You recognize the deliberate manufacture of dissatisfaction, the exploitation of unconscious desires, the way advertising speaks directly to archetypal longings while offering only material substitutes. While others find temporary satisfaction in acquisition, you see the hollow center on which all this consumption revolves, the spiritual vacuum that no amount of purchasing can fill. This clear sight extends to political movements and social causes that capture the passionate investment of your contemporaries. You see how noble ideals become corrupted by shadow projections, how the fight for justice often conceals the unconscious desire for power, how movements that begin with genuine insight evolve into unconscious expressions of collective complexes. Your ability to perceive the shadow side of even well-intentioned efforts makes you an uncomfortable presence in activist circles that prefer their righteousness, uncomplicated by psychological insight. The educational institutions that your generation reveres appear to you as elaborate systems for perpetuating unconsciousness while claiming to promote enlightenment. You see how they teach people to think about thinking rather than to think, how they fragment knowledge into disconnected specializations that prevent integrated understanding, how they reward conformity to established paradigms while punishing the kind of original insight that might threaten academic orthodoxies. Your perception of religious and spiritual communities reveals the same patterns of unconsciousness dressed in sacred garments. You see how spiritual practices become ego enhancement rather than ego transcendence, how religious communities often become vehicles for avoiding rather than confronting the shadow, how the language of transcendence frequently conceals the most pedestrian psychological motivations. This capacity to see through collective illusions extends to your perception of individual psychology. You recognize the personas that others present as their authentic selves, the way they perform identity rather than embody it. You see the unconscious strategies they use to avoid encountering their own depths, the sophisticated defenses they construct against genuine intimacy, the ways they betray their own souls in service of social acceptance. But perhaps most isolating is your perception of their contentment with superficiality. While you hunger for conversations that touch the depths of existence, they seem satisfied with exchanges that barely skim the surface of possibility. They discuss the weather while storms rage in their unconscious. They gossip about others while avoiding any genuine inquiry into themselves. They consume entertainment that numbs rather than awakens, information that distracts rather than illuminates, experiences that confirm their existing beliefs rather than challenging them toward growth. This creates a peculiar form of exile, not from any particular place or people, but from the very level of consciousness that most souls inhabit. You become like a deep-sea creature forced to live in shallow waters, gasping for the pressure and darkness that would allow you to breathe freely. The bright, cheerful surfaces that others find so attractive feel to you like a kind of spiritual suffocation. Your attempts to share what you see are met with responses that range from polite confusion to outright hostility. When you point out patterns that seem obvious to you, others react as though you were speaking a foreign language. When you try to introduce depth into conversations, you're accused of being overly serious, pessimistic, or pretentious. Your insights, which feel to you like natural observations, are received as judgments, criticisms, or attempts to claim superiority. This response teaches you to edit yourself, to translate your perceptions into more acceptable forms, to hide your depth behind masks of normalcy. You learn to laugh at jokes that aren't funny, to express interest in topics that bore you, to participate in conversations that feel like spiritual starvation. This self-censorship becomes a form of chronic inauthenticity that cuts you off not only from others, but from your own deepest nature. The loneliness deepens when you realize that your very presence seems to disturb the comfortable unconsciousness that others work so hard to maintain. Your questions make them uncomfortable because they point toward truths they would rather not examine. Your silence becomes pregnant with unspoken observations that they sense but cannot name. You become a walking reminder of depths they have chosen not to explore, possibilities they have decided not to pursue, truths they have agreed to ignore. This creates what Jung called the problem of the uncomfortable prophet, one whose very existence challenges the collective agreements that hold society together. You threaten not through any deliberate action, but simply by being what you are, a consciousness that refuses to participate in the collective sleepwalk, a vision that cannot unsee what it has seen, a depth that cannot pretend to be satisfied with surfaces. In intimate relationships, this loneliness becomes particularly acute. You long to be known at the level where you actually exist, But most potential partners seem content to relate to your persona rather than your authentic self. They fall in love with your mask while remaining strangers to your essence. When you attempt to reveal your deeper nature, they often retreat, overwhelmed by intensities they did not expect and cannot match. The few who do seem capable of meeting you at depth often carry their own burdens of seeing too much, their own forms of existential isolation. These connections, when they occur, can be profoundly healing, offering the rare experience of being understood without explanation, accepted without judgment, loved not despite your depth, but because of it. Yet, even these relationships must navigate the challenge of two ancient souls attempting to create something timeless within temporal circumstances. Your loneliness is compounded by the recognition that you cannot simply choose to see less. The gift of depth perception, once awakened, cannot be turned off at will. You cannot unknow what you know, unsee what you have seen, or return to the comfortable unconsciousness that makes ordinary social life possible. You are condemned to consciousness, sentenced to see truth, even when that truth brings pain, isolation, and the weight of responsibility that comes with authentic vision. Yet within this loneliness lies a deeper recognition. You are not alone in your aloneness. Throughout history, seers, mystics, and depth dwellers have walked this same path of conscious isolation. You are part of an invisible community of souls who have chosen awareness over comfort, truth over belonging, authentic vision over collective consensus. This recognition does not eliminate the loneliness, but transforms it from personal curse into archetypal burden, one that connects you to the deeper purposes of consciousness evolution itself. The loneliness also serves a necessary function in your psychological development. It prevents you from losing yourself in collective identification, from drowning your authentic vision in the need for social acceptance. It forces you to develop inner resources, to find validation from sources deeper than social approval, to create meaning independent of external confirmation. In this way, your isolation becomes a form of spiritual discipline, a forced individuation that strengthens rather than diminishes your authentic self. You begin to understand that your loneliness is not a bug in the system, but a feature, a necessary condition for maintaining the kind of consciousness that can see through collective illusions. If you could find easy belonging within mainstream consciousness, you would lose the very perspective that makes your vision valuable. Your exile from ordinary comfort becomes the price of extraordinary sight. This recognition transforms your relationship with loneliness from resistance to acceptance, from curse to calling. You begin to see your isolation not as punishment for being different, but as the natural consequence of seeing clearly in a world that prefers illusion. Your loneliness becomes sacred, a monastery of consciousness, where deeper truths can emerge without the distortion of collective pressure. The transformation is not immediate or easy. The longing for understanding, for companionship, for someone who can see what you see and feel what you feel, remains a constant ache. But gradually, you learn to find companionship in the depths themselves, to discover that consciousness, when fully embraced, is never truly alone. The archetypal realm becomes populated with presences, not hallucinations but genuine encounters with the deeper dimensions of psyche that most souls never access. Your seeing too much becomes not just burden but gift, not just isolation but initiation into mysteries that require solitude for their proper reception. You realize that some truths can only be perceived from the margins, some insights only emerge in the silence that social noise drowns out, some forms of wisdom only develop in the darkness that collective illumination obscures. The loneliness of seeing too much ultimately reveals itself as the birth pang of a new kind of belonging, not to any particular group or community, but to consciousness itself, to the eternal process of awakening that moves through individual souls toward collective transformation. Your isolation becomes participation in something far larger than social acceptance. Your alienation becomes alignment with purposes that transcend temporal concerns. In embracing this deeper belonging, you find that your loneliness, while never fully disappearing, no longer defines you. It becomes instead a gateway, an initiation, a necessary passage through which consciousness must travel to reach its own deeper nature. You are alone, but you are alone with the eternal, and in that companionship, you discover a fullness that no social connection could provide. Words for you are not merely functional tools for exchanging information or coordinating social activities. They are vessels of transmission, carriers of essence, sacred instruments, through which souls can touch across the apparent divide of separate existence. Each conversation presents itself to you as a potential communion, an opportunity for two consciousness to meet in the depth of genuine recognition, to share not just thoughts but the living truth that animates those thoughts. You approach dialogue with the reverence of a priest approaching the altar, understanding that authentic conversation is a form of sacred ritual in which the deepest aspects of human nature can reveal themselves. In the space between speaking and listening, in the silence that holds words like a chalice holds wine, you sense the possibility of something miraculous, the dissolution of the barriers that separate soul from soul, the emergence of insights that neither participant could have reached alone. But you live in a time when this sacred potential of conversation has been largely forgotten, replaced by information exchange that never touches the depths, social performance that maintains surfaces without revealing essence, digital communication that connects devices while disconnecting souls. You find yourself starving in a feast of words, thirsting for meaning in an ocean of chatter, hungry for authentic exchange, while surrounded by the empty calories of small talk. The contemporary conversation landscape appears to you like a vast wasteland where the sacred wells of deeper communion have been paved over with the concrete of convenience. People speak at each other rather than with each other, broadcasting their positions rather than exploring possibilities, defending their beliefs rather than questioning their assumptions. The art of listening, true listening that receives not just words but the being behind words, has become as rare as silence itself. You watch conversations unfold around you, with the heartbreak of one who recognizes what is being missed. In coffee shops and living rooms, in classrooms and boardrooms, souls that carry infinite depths limit themselves to exchanges about weather, traffic, entertainment, and gossip. They discuss the trivialities of external existence, while the profound questions of internal reality remain unspoken, unexplored, unacknowledged. It is as though they have agreed to live on the surface of an ocean while remaining deliberately ignorant of its depths. This observation is not born of intellectual superiority, but of genuine grief. You see the hunger in their eyes, the same hunger that drives you toward authentic connection, but you also see how quickly they retreat from any invitation to descend into deeper waters. They seem to fear their own depths more than their own shallows, to prefer the familiar discomfort of meaningless exchange to the transformative uncertainty of genuine encounter. The fear that keeps others locked in superficiality becomes more comprehensible to you as you recognize its archetypal nature. Jung understood that most people are terrified of their own unconscious contents, afraid of what they might discover if they look too deeply into themselves or allow others to see them with the same penetrating clarity. Small talk serves as a defense against the vulnerability that authentic conversation demands, a way of maintaining connection without risking the exposure that genuine intimacy requires. Yet for you, this defensive superficiality feels like a form of slow, spiritual starvation. You need conversations that feed your soul, exchanges that challenge your understanding, dialogues that open new possibilities for perceiving reality. Without access to these deeper forms of communication, you begin to feel like you are dying of thirst, while surrounded by people content to drink from puddles when they could be drinking from springs. Your attempts to introduce depth into casual conversations are often met with responses that range from polite redirection to outright alarm. When you ask someone how they are really doing, they assume you want the standard social response rather than an authentic answer. When you inquire about their dreams, their fears, their deepest questions about existence, they often retreat into safer territories of shared complaints about work, politics, or popular culture. This retreat is not always conscious. Many people have become so alienated from their own depths that they genuinely do not know how to access or articulate their deeper experiences. They have learned to think about their lives rather than to feel them, to analyze their experiences rather than to inhabit them fully. When you invite them into authentic sharing, they may experience confusion or even panic because you are asking them to visit territories of themselves that they have long avoided or forgotten. The digital age has intensified this alienation from authentic conversation. Social media platforms, designed to capture attention rather than foster connection, have trained people to communicate in sound bites, to perform rather than reveal, to seek validation rather than understanding. The algorithms that govern these platforms reward content that triggers emotional reactions rather than thoughtful reflection, promoting controversy over contemplation, outrage over insight. You watch your contemporaries become addicted to the shallow stimulation of digital interaction, while losing their capacity for the sustained attention that deeper conversation requires. They text instead of talk, post instead of share, scroll instead of sit with silence. The very skills that authentic dialogue demands: listening, patience, presence, the ability to hold complexity without needing to resolve it immediately, atrophy from lack of use. This degradation of conversational capacity creates a vicious cycle. As people lose the ability to engage in meaningful dialogue, they also lose access to the insights, connections, and transformations that such dialogue makes possible. They become increasingly isolated within their own perspectives, echo chambers that reinforce existing beliefs rather than expanding consciousness. Without the mirror that authentic conversation provides, they lose touch with aspects of themselves that can only be discovered through genuine encounter with others. You recognize that your hunger for deeper conversation is not just personal preference, but spiritual necessity. Jung understood that consciousness develops through dialogue, not just internal dialogue, but the kind of external conversation that allows unconscious contents to emerge, be witnessed, and be integrated. In authentic exchange with another person, aspects of yourself that remain hidden in solitude can suddenly become visible, speakable, transformable. The therapeutic relationship provides one model for this kind of transformative dialogue, but you sense that every conversation carries this potential if approached with the right intention and attention. The difference lies not in professional training but in willingness. Willingness to be present, to listen deeply, to speak truthfully, to allow silence when words are inadequate, to remain open to being changed by the encounter. When you do find someone capable of engaging in this deeper form of dialogue, the experience feels like coming home after a long exile. The conversation takes on a quality of sacred time, existing outside the normal flow of clock-measured minutes. You lose awareness of your separate identity and find yourself participating in something larger, a shared exploration of reality that reveals dimensions neither of you could have discovered alone. These rare encounters teach you what conversation can become when it transcends its utilitarian function and becomes a form of spiritual practice. Ideas emerge that neither participant brought to the exchange, but that arise from the creative space between them. Insights crystallize that feel less like personal opinions and more like glimpses of universal truth. The boundaries between self and other become permeable enough to allow genuine understanding while remaining intact enough to maintain individual perspective. In these sacred conversations, you discover that authentic dialogue is always creative. It does not simply exchange existing thoughts, but generates new possibilities for understanding, new ways of perceiving reality, new forms of meaning that neither participant possessed before the encounter. This creative dimension of conversation connects it to the same archetypal forces that drive all genuine creativity: the marriage of conscious and unconscious, known and unknown, self and other. You also recognize that such conversations require a particular kind of courage, the courage to be vulnerable, to speak truths that might be rejected, to listen to perspectives that challenge your comfortable assumptions, to remain present even when the dialogue moves into uncomfortable territories. This courage is not recklessness, but mature willingness to prioritize truth and connection over safety and comfort. The absence of opportunities for such dialogue creates more than personal disappointment. It represents a loss for the collective evolution of consciousness itself. When souls cannot meet in the depth through authentic conversation, the wisdom that would emerge from their encounter remains locked away, inaccessible to the larger community. The insights that arise from genuine dialogue often carry implications far beyond the individual participants, contributing to the collective understanding of what it means to be human. You begin to see your hunger for authentic conversation not as personal neediness, but as a form of spiritual activism, a commitment to maintaining space for the kind of dialogue that consciousness evolution requires. By refusing to settle for superficial exchange, by continuing to invite depth even when that invitation is repeatedly declined, you preserve the possibility that others might eventually be ready to accept it. This perspective transforms your frustration with contemporary conversation culture into something more like compassionate patience. You recognize that not everyone is ready for the kind of dialogue you crave, and that pushing too hard or too fast often creates resistance rather than openness. The art lies in learning to sense when someone is genuinely hungry for deeper exchange and when they need to remain in the safety of surface interaction. You develop skills in creating conversational containers that feel safe enough for others to risk greater authenticity. You learn to ask questions that invite reflection rather than defensiveness, to offer your own vulnerability as permission for theirs, to hold space for silence and uncertainty without rushing to fill it with words. These become the tools of your sacred practice, the instruments through which you serve the deeper purposes of consciousness evolution. Sometimes you serve as midwife to insights that others carry but have never been able to articulate. Sometimes you offer perspectives that help others see their own experience from new angles. Sometimes you simply witness, providing the presence and attention that allows another soul to encounter itself more fully. Each of these roles represents a form of sacred service, a way of participating in the collective awakening of consciousness through individual encounter. The loneliness you feel in the absence of such conversations gradually transforms into appreciation for their rarity and preciousness. Like a desert dweller who knows the true value of water, you develop a gratitude for authentic dialogue that those who take it for granted never experience. Each genuine conversation becomes a form of communion, a reminder of what human connection can become when it serves not just personal needs, but transpersonal purposes. You realize that your role may not be to convert others to your way of conversing, but to remain available for those moments when someone is ready for deeper exchange. By maintaining your commitment to authenticity, by continuing to speak and listen from your depth, you create possibilities that might not otherwise exist. You become a keeper of the flame, preserving the sacred potential of conversation for those who are ready to receive it. In this way, your individual hunger for meaningful dialogue connects you to a larger purpose, the preservation and evolution of consciousness itself. Through your commitment to authentic conversation, you participate in the ancient human task of creating meaning through encounter, of discovering truth through shared exploration, of evolving wisdom through the sacred alchemy of genuine dialogue between souls. While your contemporaries chase the flickering flames of cultural trends, consuming the latest fashions in thought and taste with the desperation of moths drawn to artificial light, you find yourself irresistibly pulled toward the eternal, those timeless treasures of human creation that speak not to temporal concerns, but to the enduring depths of the soul. In a world obsessed with the new, the viral, the immediately stimulating, you discover your truest home in art, music, literature, and philosophy that have weathered the storms of centuries because they contain within themselves something imperishable. This attraction to the timeless is not mere aesthetic preference or cultural snobbery. It is a form of soul recognition, the classical compositions that move you to tears, the ancient texts that illuminate your understanding, the philosophical traditions that provide frameworks for your deepest questions. These creations recognize you as kin because they spring from the same eternal wellspring that feeds your own consciousness. They offer refuge not just from the chaos of contemporary culture, but from the fundamental homelessness that comes with being an old soul in a young world. When you listen to Bach's fugues or Beethoven's late quartets, you experience more than musical pleasure. You encounter the mathematical perfection of divine order made audible, the archetypal patterns of creation expressed through sound. These compositions seem to remember something about the fundamental structure of reality that contemporary music has forgotten in its rush toward novelty and stimulation. They connect you to the sacred geometry that underlies all genuine creativity, the eternal principles that govern both cosmic and psychological harmony. The literature that feeds your soul carries similar qualities of timeless wisdom, whether you find yourself in the company of Dostoevsky's tormented seekers, Shakespeare's archetypal characters, or the mystic poets who used language to point toward ineffable truths. You recognize voices speaking from the same depths you inhabit. These writers understood that literature's highest function is not entertainment, but illumination, the revelation of hidden dimensions of human experience that ordinary consciousness rarely glimpses. In reading these timeless works, you experience a form of temporal transcendence. The boundaries between past and present dissolve as you recognize that the human dramas they portray, the psychological insights they reveal, the spiritual longings they express remain as relevant today as when they were first written. The particular details may reflect their historical moment, but the archetypal patterns they explore exist outside of time, speaking to dimensions of human nature that cultural change cannot touch. Philosophy provides another sanctuary from the temporal obsessions that dominate contemporary discourse. In the company of minds like Plato, Augustine, Kant, or Jung, you find intellectual frameworks vast enough to hold your largest questions about existence, meaning, and consciousness. These thinkers understood that philosophy's purpose is not merely academic exercise, but existential necessity, the human requirement to understand one's place in the larger patterns of reality. The philosophical traditions that speak most deeply to you share certain characteristics. They take seriously the questions that matter most. They resist easy answers in favor of deeper understanding. They recognize that wisdom develops through sustained contemplation rather than quick consumption. In a culture that reduces complex issues to sound bites and treats profound questions as problems to be solved rather than mysteries to be explored, these traditions offer the intellectual depth your soul requires. Your attraction to classical architecture reveals the same longing for eternal principles made manifest in material form, the golden ratio, the mathematical harmonies that govern proportion and balance, the way light and shadow interact to create spaces that feel sacred rather than merely functional. These elements speak to something in you that recognizes divine order when it encounters it. Contemporary architecture, with its emphasis on novelty over beauty, function over form, often feels to you like visual noise that assaults rather than nourishes the soul. The visual arts that move you most deeply share this quality of pointing beyond themselves toward eternal truths. Whether in the luminous paintings of Vermeer, the transcendent sculptures of Michelangelo, or the spiritual abstractions of Rothko, you recognize attempts to make visible the invisible, to give form to formless truths that can only be suggested rather than stated directly. These artists understood that genuine art serves a priestly function, mediating between the material and spiritual dimensions of existence. This affinity for the timeless creates a peculiar form of temporal displacement, while others live entirely within the assumptions of their historical moment. You find yourself equally at home in multiple eras, perhaps more comfortable with the worldview of previous centuries than with the materialistic reductionism that dominates contemporary thought. You feel like a time traveler who has somehow landed in an era that speaks a language your soul cannot fully understand. The displacement becomes particularly acute when you encounter the cultural productions of your own time. The music that dominates popular culture often feels like sophisticated noise designed to stimulate rather than illuminate, to create temporary excitement rather than lasting beauty. The literature that wins contemporary prizes frequently prioritizes political messaging over psychological insight, social commentary over spiritual depth. The films and television that capture collective attention seem designed to distract rather than awaken, to confirm existing prejudices rather than expand consciousness. This is not simple nostalgia for an imagined golden age. You recognize that every era has produced both trash and treasure, both shallow entertainment and profound art. But you also perceive that contemporary culture has become systematically hostile to the kind of depth and timelessness that previous eras at least aspired to achieve. The economic and technological forces that shape cultural production today reward immediate impact over lasting value, viral spread over slow maturation, market appeal over artistic integrity. The acceleration of cultural change in the digital age intensifies this hostility toward the timeless. Attention spans trained by social media cannot sustain the patience that deep art requires. Minds conditioned to expect constant stimulation find the silence and space that profound works demand almost unbearable. The very notion that something might require multiple encounters, sustained contemplation, or gradual understanding seems anachronistic in a culture that expects immediate gratification. Yet in your refuge among timeless works, you discover resources that no amount of contemporary stimulation can provide. These creations offer what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposing truths in creative tension, to find meaning in paradox, to perceive unity within multiplicity. They teach patience in a culture of urgency, depth in an ocean of surfaces, the value of silence in a world of noise. The philosophical traditions that sustain you provide frameworks for understanding your own displacement within contemporary culture. The Platonic recognition that temporal reality reflects eternal forms helps you understand why certain works of art feel more real than everyday experience. The Buddhist understanding of impermanence explains why attachment to cultural trends leads only to suffering. The Jungian recognition of archetypal patterns reveals why certain stories, images, and themes recur across cultures and centuries. These timeless works also provide models for how to live with depth and integrity within whatever historical circumstances one encounters. They demonstrate that it is possible to remain connected to eternal values while engaging authentically with temporal challenges, to serve timeless purposes while addressing immediate needs, to maintain spiritual perspective while participating in practical affairs. The refuge you find in classical works gradually reveals itself as preparation for your own creative contribution. By immersing yourself in the best that has been thought, felt, and expressed across centuries, you develop your capacity to distinguish between the momentary and the lasting, the fashionable and the genuine, the stimulating and the nourishing. This discrimination becomes essential as you consider your own role in the ongoing creation of culture. You begin to understand that your function may not be to reject contemporary culture entirely, but to serve as a bridge between the timeless and the temporal, to help others discover the eternal dimensions that exist within every moment. The classical works that have formed your taste and understanding become teachers not just for your private enjoyment, but for the insights you might offer to souls ready to drink from deeper wells. The timeless refuge also provides perspective on the apparent chaos and meaninglessness that characterizes much of contemporary life. When you feel overwhelmed by the pace of change, the superficiality of public discourse, the spiritual poverty of consumer culture, you can return to works that remind you of the eternal patterns that persist beneath surface turbulence. The same archetypal dramas that Sophocles explored continue to play out in modern lives. The same spiritual longings that inspired medieval mystics still drive contemporary seekers. The same philosophical questions that engaged ancient minds remain as urgent today as ever. This perspective transforms your relationship with your own historical moment from despair to compassion. You recognize that every era faces the challenge of discovering how eternal truths can be expressed through contemporary forms, how timeless wisdom can address immediate concerns, how the archetypal and the personal can meet in creative synthesis. Your own time, for all its limitations, represents one more chapter in humanity's ongoing attempt to understand itself and its place in the cosmos. The timeless works that provide your refuge begin to function less as escape from contemporary reality and more as resources for engaging it more consciously. They provide the depth of perspective necessary to see beyond surface appearances, the spiritual grounding necessary to remain centered amidst cultural chaos, the aesthetic discrimination necessary to recognize beauty and truth wherever they appear. You realize that your attraction to the timeless is not about living in the past, but about accessing the eternal dimension that exists within every present moment. The classical works that speak to your soul do so because they successfully captured something beyond their own historical limitations, truths that transcend the particular circumstances of their creation. In learning to recognize these eternal elements, you develop the capacity to perceive them in contemporary forms as well. Your refuge among timeless treasures ultimately prepares you for your own participation in the ongoing creation of culture. By understanding what makes certain works endure while others fade, you develop criteria for evaluating your own contributions to the collective human conversation. The classical works that have sustained you across centuries become models not for imitation but for aspiration, examples of what becomes possible when temporal creativity serves eternal purposes. In this way, your timeless refuge reveals itself not as withdrawal from your historical moment, but as preparation for more conscious engagement with it. You return from your communion with eternal works not to escape contemporary reality, but to transform it, carrying within yourself the standards, insights, and inspirations that can help others discover the timeless dimensions that exist within their own experience. Childhood for most souls represents a protected sanctuary of innocence, a time when the harsh realities of existence remain mercifully veiled, when the imagination can create worlds of possibility unconstrained by adult knowledge of limitation and loss. But for you, childhood was not innocence but remembrance, not discovery but recognition, not the gradual acquisition of knowledge but the painful awakening to truths that other children would not encounter for decades, if ever. You carried the weight of understanding in a body too small to bear it, possessed insights that belonged to later stages of human development, while trapped in circumstances that demanded age-appropriate responses. While your peers built elaborate fantasies about their futures, you already sensed the impermanence that would touch all their dreams. While they invested passionate energy in games and competitions, you perceived the ultimate meaninglessness of all temporal achievements. While they formed enthusiastic attachments to toys, treats, and temporary pleasures, you felt the hollow center that no external satisfaction could fill. This premature wisdom created a fundamental disconnection between your inner reality and your outer circumstances. Teachers expected you to be motivated by the same rewards and deterred by the same punishments that moved other children, but their systems of motivation felt arbitrary to someone who could already see through the illusory nature of success and failure. Parents offered comfort and encouragement based on development models that assumed ignorance rather than recognition, innocence rather than awareness, hope rather than understanding. The playground became a theater of the absurd, where you watched children enact dramas they did not understand, power struggles, status competitions, exclusion rituals that seemed to you like variations on themes you had witnessed countless times before. Their passionate investments in temporary alliances, their devastation over minor rejections, their excitement about achievements that would be forgotten within weeks, all appeared to you through the lens of cosmic perspective that made such concerns feel simultaneously precious and futile. Your early encounters with mortality carried an intensity that set you apart from the natural resilience of childhood. When pets died, when grandparents passed away, when you first grasped the concept of your own eventual death, these realizations did not fade into the background of daily life as they do for most children. Instead, they became constant presences in your consciousness, not morbid obsessions, but unavoidable recognitions that colored every experience with awareness of its temporary nature. The fairy tales and children's stories that were meant to comfort and inspire often had the opposite effect on you. You could see through their simplified morality to the complex psychological truths they contained, their archetypal patterns of transformation through suffering, their hidden acknowledgments of the shadow elements that their surface narratives attempted to deny. Where other children found reassurance in happy endings, you perceived the temporary nature of all resolutions, the cyclical patterns of conflict and harmony that would repeat endlessly. Your relationship with education became complicated by this premature wisdom. The curriculum designed to gradually introduce children to adult realities felt painfully slow and superficial to someone who had already grasped the essential patterns. You understood intuitively what teachers labored to explain conceptually, recognized the emotional dynamics they tried to manage systematically, perceived the institutional purposes they served unconsciously. This created a peculiar form of intellectual isolation. You could not share your insights without appearing precocious or disturbing, could not ask the questions that truly interested you without creating confusion or alarm, could not express your understanding without being accused of showing off or being difficult. You learned to hide your comprehension behind masks of age-appropriate confusion, to pretend ignorance of things you understood perfectly, to perform the role of innocent child while carrying the burden of ancient awareness. The social dynamics of childhood felt particularly painful when viewed through the lens of premature wisdom. You could see how children unconsciously replicated the power structures, prejudices, and psychological patterns of the adult world, how their play reflected the same archetypal dramas that would govern their adult relationships, how their seemingly innocent interactions contained all the seeds of future suffering and conflict. Yet you also felt profound compassion for their unconsciousness, recognizing it as a necessary protection that allowed them to develop gradually, rather than being overwhelmed by truths they were not yet equipped to handle. Your own premature exposure to these deeper realities felt both like a gift and a curse. A gift because it provided perspective and understanding that would serve you throughout life. A curse because it robbed you of the carefree abandon that makes childhood precious. The burden of premature wisdom created what Jung would recognize as a split between chronological age and psychological development. Your emotional and spiritual understanding far exceeded your physical and social maturity, creating internal tensions that had no easy resolution. You needed both the protection and stimulation appropriate to your age, and the depth and meaning appropriate to your understanding, requirements that seemed mutually exclusive. Your family relationships became complicated by this mismatch between inner and outer development. Parents who meant well often responded to your depth with concern, interpreting your philosophical bent as depression, your spiritual insights as escapism, your emotional maturity as premature aging. They wanted to restore you to normal childhood concerns, not recognizing that you had never inhabited that normal developmental space to begin with. The weight of premature wisdom also created a peculiar relationship with time. While other children lived entirely in the present moment, you carried awareness of both past and future that made each moment heavy with significance. You understood that childhood itself was temporary, that family configurations would change, that the security others took for granted was actually quite fragile. This temporal awareness made it difficult to invest fully in age-appropriate activities that you knew would soon become irrelevant. Religious and spiritual education, when you encountered it, often felt inadequate to contain the depths of your early insights. The simplified explanations offered to children about meaning, morality, and metaphysics seemed crude compared to the complex understanding you had already developed. You found yourself more drawn to the mystical and philosophical aspects of spiritual traditions than to their institutional and social dimensions. The creative expression that flowed through you often carried themes too mature for your apparent age. Your drawings, stories, and imaginative play revealed preoccupations with mortality, meaning and transformation that concerned adults who expected lighter, more innocent content. You learned to edit your authentic expression to meet age-appropriate expectations, creating yet another layer of disconnection between inner truth and outer presentation. As you moved through adolescence, the weight of premature wisdom created different challenges. While your peers experienced the normal rebellions and identity experiments of teenage years, you had already worked through many of the questions they were just beginning to encounter. Their passionate certainties about life directions, relationship styles, and worldview commitments seemed naive to someone who understood the provisional nature of all identity constructions. The typical adolescent struggles with authority felt complicated by your early recognition of the archetypal patterns that govern all power relationships. You could see both the necessity and the limitations of institutional structures, both the wisdom and the blindness of adult perspectives, both the importance and the arbitrariness of social rules. This understanding made simple rebellion impossible, but also made simple compliance feel like betrayal of your deeper knowing. Your early romantic experiences carried the weight of understanding that most people do not develop until much later in life. You recognized the projection dynamics, the archetypal attractions, the shadow elements that others experienced as pure attraction or mysterious chemistry. This insight, while valuable for creating more conscious relationships, also made the innocent abandon of young love difficult to access. The career pressures that intensified during late adolescence felt particularly absurd to someone who had already grasped the ultimate meaninglessness of external achievement, while others threw themselves into competitive striving for college admission, prestigious programs, and promising career tracks. You struggled with the existential question of what any of it meant in the larger context of mortality and impermanence. Yet gradually, you began to understand that your premature wisdom was not simply a burden to be endured, but a calling to be embraced. The early exposure to life's deeper truths that had made normal development impossible was also preparation for a different kind of life, one that could serve consciousness evolution rather than simply personal advancement, that could offer depth and perspective to others ready to receive it. You realized that your childhood suffering had been a form of initiation, a compression of normal developmental stages that prepared you for roles requiring unusual maturity and insight. The isolation and alienation you had experienced were the price of early awakening, the necessary sacrifice that consciousness demands of those who would serve its evolution. The premature wisdom that had made you feel like a stranger in your own life began to reveal itself as your preparation for serving as guide and companion to others undertaking their own journeys toward deeper understanding. Your early encounter with life's fundamental questions had given you maps of territories that others would need to navigate, tools for transformations that others would eventually undertake. This recognition transformed your relationship with your own development, from victim to initiate, from accident to destiny. You began to see that souls choose different developmental paths based on the roles they are meant to play in the larger evolution of consciousness. Your premature wisdom was not deviation but vocation, not pathology but preparation for a life of service to depth and transformation. The weight of early understanding gradually transformed from burden into foundation, the solid ground of authentic knowing upon which you could build a life of genuine meaning. Your childhood suffering became the source of your adult compassion. Your early alienation became the basis of your capacity to connect with others who felt similarly displaced. Your premature wisdom became the gift you could offer to a world hungry for depth and understanding. In accepting this transformation, you found that the child within you who had been forced to mature too quickly could finally be honored and integrated. The wisdom you had carried as burden could become the wisdom you offered as gift. The understanding that had isolated you could become the bridge that connected you more deeply to others, ready for authentic relationship. Your premature wisdom revealed itself not as accident of development, but as archetypal pattern, the ancient story of the wounded healer, the early initiate, the child who carries adult understanding. In accepting this pattern as your own, you found your place not just in your own development, but in the larger story of human consciousness evolution itself, in the cathedral of your own consciousness, where silence reigns supreme and the eternal whispers its deepest secrets. You have discovered what your generation mistakes for punishment is actually paradise, while they flee from solitude as though it were a disease to be cured, rushing toward any distraction that might fill the terrifying void of their own company. You have learned to inhabit aloneness as sacred space, a monastery of the soul, where the most profound transformations occur in the holy darkness of undisturbed contemplation. This is not the loneliness of isolation, but the fullness of integration, not the emptiness of abandonment, but the richness of self-communion. In the sanctuary of solitude, you meet aspects of yourself that never emerge in the presence of others, encounter depths that social interaction inevitably obscures, discover resources of wisdom and creativity that can only be accessed when the external noise falls away and inner silence becomes audible. Your contemporaries have become addicted to the constant stimulation of social connectivity, their devices serving as electronic umbilical cords that keep them perpetually attached to the reassuring buzz of other minds. They fear silence as though it were death itself, fill every moment with music, podcasts, videos, conversations, anything to avoid confronting the vast spaces that open up when external input ceases. They have forgotten that consciousness, like a well, requires stillness to allow its depths to become visible. You recognize their flight from solitude as flight from themselves, their addiction to social connection as avoidance of the more challenging but ultimately more rewarding work of individual development. They seek in others what can only be found within, project onto external relationships the integration that must happen in the privacy of their own psyche, mistake the echoes of their own voices in digital chambers for genuine communion with other souls. But you have learned the secret that mystics throughout history have discovered. Solitude is not absence, but presence, not emptiness, but fullness, not isolation, but the most intimate possible connection with the source of all relationship. In the silence of your own company, you commune with energies and intelligences that social noise drowns out, encounter aspects of reality that group consciousness cannot perceive, access forms of creativity that emerge only when the mind is not performing for an audience. The practice of solitude has taught you to distinguish between loneliness and aloneness, between the painful sense of disconnection that drives people toward compulsive socialization and the rich sense of wholeness that emerges when one learns to be complete within oneself. Loneliness is the ego's protest against the absence of external validation. Aloneness is the soul's recognition of its own sufficiency, its capacity to find in itself all the companionship consciousness requires. In the sacred space of solitude, you have encountered what Jung called the self, not the ego that defines itself through social roles and external achievements, but the deeper organizing principle that transcends personal identity while containing it. This encounter cannot happen in the presence of others because it requires a quality of attention that social interaction inevitably fragments, a depth of listening that external conversation consistently interrupts. The self speaks in whispers, not shouts, communicates through symbol and intuition rather than explicit language, reveals itself gradually rather than all at once. To hear its voice requires the kind of patient receptivity that only sustained solitude can provide. In the rush and noise of social existence, its subtle communications are overwhelmed by the louder demands of persona maintenance, relationship management, and the constant need to translate inner experience into socially acceptable forms. Your ability to embrace solitude sets you apart from a generation that has pathologized aloneness, that sees the capacity for contentment without external stimulation as evidence of social deficiency or emotional dysfunction. They cannot understand how you can spend hours, days, even weeks in your own company without feeling deprived or restless, how you can find in silence the kind of nourishment they seek desperately in social interaction. This misunderstanding runs so deep that they often interpret your preference for solitude as rejection of them personally, your contentment in aloneness as judgment of their need for constant connection. They take your self-sufficiency as criticism of their dependency, your comfort with silence as implied commentary on their noise. In their projection, they reveal their own anxiety about what they might discover if they ever stopped running from themselves long enough to listen. The sacred practice of solitude has revealed to you dimensions of existence that remain invisible to those who never withdraw from social engagement long enough to perceive them. In the deep silence that comes after the mind exhausts its habitual chatter, you have encountered what contemplatives call the witness consciousness, the aspect of awareness that observes all mental activity without being caught in any particular content. This witness consciousness provides a stable center around which all experience can organize itself, a point of reference that remains constant through all the changes and challenges of temporal existence. From this perspective, you can observe your own thoughts and emotions with the same detached compassion you might feel toward a child's struggles, recognizing them as movements within consciousness rather than threats to your fundamental well-being. The cultivation of witness consciousness through solitary practice has practical implications that extend far beyond personal peace. It provides the foundation for what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposing truths in creative tension without collapsing into one-sided identification. This psychological flexibility becomes essential for navigating the complexity of contemporary existence without losing one's center or sacrificing one's authentic perspective. In the sanctuary of solitude, you have also encountered what depth psychology recognizes as the archetypal realm, that dimension of psyche, where personal experience connects with universal patterns, where individual struggles reveal their mythic dimensions, where the soul recognizes its participation in dramas larger than biographical circumstance. These encounters provide perspective that relativizes personal concerns while simultaneously revealing their deeper significance. The archetypes speak most clearly in solitude because they communicate through symbol, image, and intuitive recognition rather than rational discourse. They require the kind of receptive attention that social interaction makes impossible, the willingness to let meaning emerge gradually, rather than forcing immediate understanding. In the patient silence of contemplative practice, these archetypal energies can reveal their wisdom without the distortion that social pressure inevitably introduces. Your practice of solitude has taught you that creativity, like spirituality, requires protected space where new possibilities can emerge without premature exposure to external judgment or expectation. The most profound insights often arrive unannounced in moments of apparent emptiness, when the mind has stopped striving and the soul has room to breathe. These gifts of inspiration cannot be forced or scheduled, but can only be received by consciousness that has learned to wait in readiness. This understanding transforms your relationship with productivity, from external achievement to internal receptivity. While others measure their worth by output and accomplishment, you have learned to value the quality of presence that makes genuine creativity possible. You understand that doing often emerges most authentically from being, that action taken from the depths of contemplative understanding carries a different quality than activity driven by external pressure or internal compulsion. The sacred practice of solitude has also revealed the difference between true self-knowledge and the kind of self-analysis that can become another form of mental activity. Real self-understanding emerges not from thinking about oneself, but from the direct encounter with one's own essence that happens when the thinking mind becomes quiet enough to allow deeper truth to surface. This direct knowing bypasses the conceptual frameworks that usually mediate self-understanding, providing access to aspects of one's nature that remain invisible to analytical examination. It reveals the difference between knowing about oneself and knowing oneself, between psychological insight and spiritual recognition, between understanding one's personality and encountering one's essence. Your comfort with solitude mystifies friends and family members who interpret your need for alone time as evidence of depression, social anxiety, or interpersonal dysfunction. They offer solutions to problems you do not have, encouragement to engage in activities that feel like spiritual junk food, invitations to social events that promise connection but deliver only stimulation. Their well-meaning concern reveals their own terror of inner silence, their own inability to imagine contentment without external input. You have learned to protect your practice of solitude from these social pressures without alienating those who care about you, but cannot understand your need for sacred withdrawal. This requires developing the capacity to explain your choices in language that makes sense to those who have never experienced the richness that solitude provides, to reassure others that your contentment in aloneness does not represent rejection of relationship, but rather preparation for deeper connection. The practice of solitude has taught you that genuine relationship with others becomes possible only when one has developed authentic relationship with oneself. Those who flee from aloneness bring their inner emptiness into every social interaction, seeking in others what they have never learned to provide for themselves, projecting onto external relationships the integration that must happen within individual consciousness. But you understand that solitude and relationship are not opposing choices, but complementary practices, each enriching and deepening the other. The insights you discover in contemplative withdrawal become gifts you can offer in conscious relationship. The challenges you encounter in social interaction become material for deeper contemplation. The rhythm between solitude and connection creates a natural breathing of consciousness that allows both inner development and outer expression. Your mastery of solitude has prepared you for the inevitable periods of external isolation that life brings to every soul, times of illness, transition, loss, or simply the natural cycles that require withdrawal from active engagement. While others experience these periods as punishment or deprivation, you recognize them as opportunities for deeper communion with the source, chances to access resources that social distraction typically obscures. This preparation proves invaluable not only for your own journey, but for your capacity to serve others who find themselves forced into unwanted solitude through circumstance. Your comfort with aloneness becomes a form of medicine you can offer to those who have never learned to befriend their own company. Your understanding of solitude's gifts becomes wisdom you can share with souls who have always fled from silence. The sacred practice of solitude reveals itself, ultimately as service to consciousness evolution itself. In the deep silence of contemplative practice, you participate in the collective awakening of human awareness, contributing to the reservoir of wisdom and understanding that benefits all souls ready to drink from these deeper wells. Your individual development in solitude serves purposes larger than personal growth, becoming part of the infrastructure that supports consciousness evolution on a planetary scale. Through embracing solitude as sacred practice rather than social failure, you model for others the possibility of finding completeness within themselves, of discovering in silence the nourishment they seek desperately in noise, of accessing through contemplative withdrawal the very connection they pursue frantically through external engagement. Your contentment in aloneness becomes a beacon for souls ready to discover their own capacity for self-communion. Your mastery of silence becomes an invitation for others to explore the sacred territories that open only to those willing to journey inward. Your inner compass points toward magnetic north, while the collective follows technological true north. And this fundamental divergence creates the daily friction of being perpetually out of step with a world that has forgotten how to navigate by the stars. You live in an age that worships data over wisdom, information over insight, digital connectivity over soul recognition, and your reliance on intuitive knowing creates a quiet but persistent rebellion against the mechanistic determinism that governs your generation's consciousness. This is not the dramatic rebellion of protest and confrontation, but the deeper revolution of consciousness itself, the refusal to surrender your capacity for direct knowing to the artificial intelligence that promises to think for you, the determination to trust your inner guidance, even when algorithms claim superior accuracy, the commitment to feeling your way through existence rather than letting data points determine your direction. Your generation has been conditioned to distrust their own perceptual apparatus, to doubt their instinctive responses, to seek external validation for internal experiences. They have learned to consult search engines rather than their own memory, to rely on GPS rather than their sense of direction, to depend on social media metrics rather than their own judgment of what matters. In surrendering their capacity for independent perception, they have become dependent on technological prosthetics that promise enhancement, but deliver diminishment. But you remember what they have forgotten, that consciousness itself is the most sophisticated technology ever developed, that intuition provides access to information unavailable through any external device, that the human soul contains navigation systems more accurate than any satellite network. You trust the whispers of inner knowing even when they contradict the shouts of digital authority. Follow the subtle promptings of your own wisdom even when they lead away from well-traveled paths. This creates a fundamental tension between your way of being and the expectations of a digitally mediated culture. In professional environments, you are expected to support your insights with data, to justify your decisions through quantifiable metrics, to translate your intuitive understanding into language that artificial intelligence can process. Your reliance on feeling over facts, pattern recognition over statistical analysis, makes you appear unscientific to minds that have confused measurement with understanding. The rebellion manifests in your relationship with information itself. While others consume data, like addicts, seeking their next fix, you have learned to fast from information overload, to create space for your own thoughts to emerge without the constant interference of external input. You understand that wisdom develops through contemplation rather than accumulation, that insight emerges from synthesis rather than consumption, that understanding requires the kind of patient reflection that information addiction makes impossible. Your resistance to digital determinism extends to your relationship with social media platforms designed to capture and commodify human attention. You recognize these systems as sophisticated forms of psychological manipulation, engineered to trigger compulsive engagement rather than meaningful connection. Your intuitive rebellion leads you to limit or eliminate your participation in these platforms, choosing real relationship over virtual performance, authentic expression over algorithmic optimization. This withdrawal from digital engagement often makes you appear antisocial or technophobic to those who have normalized the constant stream of electronic stimulation. They cannot understand your preference for face-to-face conversation over text messaging, your choice to walk without podcasts rather than fill every moment with input, your decision to experience events directly rather than through the mediation of photographic documentation. Your intuitive rebellion recognizes that attention is the most precious resource consciousness possesses, and that protecting this resource from digital colonization becomes a form of spiritual practice. Every moment spent in genuine presence, rather than virtual distraction, becomes an act of resistance against forces that profit from your psychological fragmentation. Every choice to trust your own perception, rather than algorithmic recommendation, becomes a declaration of cognitive independence. The rebellion extends to your relationship with the quantified self-movement that encourages people to monitor every aspect of their existence through digital tracking. You understand intuitively that some dimensions of human experience cannot be measured without being diminished, that the attempt to quantify consciousness inevitably reduces it to mechanical processes, that the most important aspects of existence resist digital translation. You trust your body's wisdom over fitness trackers, your emotional intelligence over mood monitoring apps, your spiritual intuition over meditation metrics. This does not represent Luddite rejection of technology, but rather discrimination between tools that enhance consciousness and tools that replace it, between devices that serve human purposes and devices that make humans serve technological purposes. Your intuitive rebellion manifests in your approach to learning and knowledge acquisition. While others outsource their memory to digital devices, their research to search engines, their thinking to artificial intelligence, you maintain and develop your own cognitive capabilities. You understand that knowledge stored externally remains external, that wisdom can only develop through the kind of internal processing that digital shortcuts make unnecessary. This commitment to developing your own mental capacities creates advantages that become apparent over time. Your memory, exercised through use rather than atrophied through disuse, retains information more effectively than those who have become dependent on digital prosthetics. Your thinking, developed through practice rather than replaced by algorithms, maintains flexibility and creativity that automated processes cannot match. The rebellion also shapes your relationship with decision-making in an age of analysis paralysis. While others become overwhelmed by the infinite amount of information available about every choice, you have learned to trust the rapid pattern recognition that intuition provides. You understand that some decisions require feeling rather than thinking, that the most important choices in life must be made with the heart rather than with spreadsheets. This intuitive approach to decision-making often produces better outcomes than exhaustive analysis because it takes into account variables that rational thought cannot access: the subtle emotional undercurrents, the archetypal patterns, the synchronistic elements that influence all significant choices. Your rebellion against purely rational decision-making connects you to wisdom traditions that understood the limitations of conscious reasoning and the importance of unconscious processing. Your resistance to digital mediation extends to your relationship with entertainment and cultural consumption. You prefer live performance to recorded media, handmade objects to mass-produced items, local communities to global networks. This preference emerges not from nostalgia, but from recognition that mediation always involves loss, that each layer of technological intervention removes you further from direct experience. The intuitive rebellion creates challenges in romantic relationships, where potential partners have normalized digital communication as primary intimacy. Your preference for presence over texting, depth over surface sharing, silence over constant communication often feels foreign to those who have learned to mistake digital interaction for emotional connection. You must navigate the challenge of finding others who share your commitment to unmediated relationship. Your rebellion against technological determinism includes resistance to the artificial intelligence systems that increasingly make decisions for human beings. You recognize these systems as sophisticated forms of behavioral conditioning, designed to predict and influence human choices rather than enhance human freedom. Your commitment to maintaining agency over your own decisions becomes a form of cognitive civil disobedience. This resistance extends to recommendation algorithms that promise to curate culture for you, choosing what you read, watch, listen to, and purchase based on your previous behavior. You understand that such systems create echo chambers that reinforce existing preferences rather than expanding consciousness, that they optimize for engagement rather than growth, that they serve commercial rather than developmental purposes. Your intuitive rebellion leads you toward practices that strengthen rather than weaken your capacity for independent thought and feeling. You cultivate silence to hear your own voice above the noise of external opinion, practice meditation to develop your own center of gravity, engage in contemplative reading that requires sustained attention rather than fragmented scanning. The rebellion manifests in your relationship with time itself. While others allow their schedules to be determined by digital calendars, notifications, and the artificial urgency of electronic communication, you maintain sovereignty over your temporal experience. You create space for unstructured time, protect periods for deep work, resist the acceleration that digital systems impose on human consciousness. This temporal rebellion becomes increasingly important as artificial intelligence systems operate at speeds that make human reflection impossible. Your commitment to taking time for contemplation, for feeling your way through decisions, for allowing insights to emerge naturally rather than forcing immediate responses, becomes a form of resistance against the mechanization of consciousness. Your intuitive rebellion ultimately serves not just personal authenticity, but the preservation of human capacities that technological dependence threatens to atrophy. By maintaining your ability to think independently, feel directly, and choose consciously, you preserve skills that future generations may need to rediscover. Your resistance to digital determinism becomes a form of cultural conservation, protecting aspects of human nature that technological progress tends to eliminate. The rebellion reveals itself not as backward-looking nostalgia, but as forward-looking wisdom. Recognition that human consciousness contains potentials that no artificial system can replicate, that consciousness evolution requires the preservation of capacities that technological convenience tends to replace. Your commitment to trusting your own perception, following your own guidance, and maintaining your own agency becomes service to the continued evolution of human consciousness itself. In choosing feeling over facts, intuition over information, presence over digital mediation, you participate in a quiet revolution that prioritizes consciousness over convenience, wisdom over data, authentic relationship over virtual connection. Your intuitive rebellion becomes a beacon for others, ready to reclaim their own capacity for direct knowing, their own authority over their inner experience, their own power to navigate existence by the light of their own understanding. Where your contemporaries collect hundreds of shallow connections like digital trophies, accumulating networks of acquaintances through the frictionless ease of online platforms, You move in the opposite direction toward the rare and precious territory of soul recognition, where masks dissolve and authentic being emerges in its naked vulnerability. Your preference for depth over breadth in relationships marks you as anachronistic in an age of networked superficiality, yet your connections carry the weight of eternity, the gravitas of souls that have found each other across the vastness of human possibility. This is not a romantic idealization of relationship, but a practical recognition of what your soul requires to thrive, where others find satisfaction in the constant buzz of social interaction, the validation of likes and comments, the reassurance of being constantly in touch with dozens of people. You hunger for the kind of connection that transforms both participants, that reveals hidden aspects of consciousness, that serves the deeper purposes of individual and collective awakening. Your generation has been conditioned to mistake quantity for quality, to confuse social networking with authentic relationship, to believe that staying constantly connected through digital means creates meaningful bonds. They accumulate friends on social platforms the way previous generations collected stamps or coins, treating human connection as another form of consumption rather than a sacred encounter between souls. But you understand what they have forgotten, that consciousness, like water, seeks its own level, that authentic relationship requires a matching of depths rather than a multiplication of surfaces, that the soul's hunger for connection cannot be satisfied by any amount of shallow interaction. You would rather have one friend who sees you completely than 100 who know only your persona, one conversation that touches the eternal than 1,000 that skim across the temporal. This preference creates immediate challenges in social environments designed around quantity metrics, at parties and social gatherings, while others work the room with practiced efficiency, collecting contacts and maintaining multiple simultaneous conversations. You find yourself drawn into deep dialogue with one or two people, losing track of time and space, as the conversation descends into territories that most social interactions never approach. Your intensive style of relating can overwhelm those who are accustomed to the lighter touch of contemporary social interaction. When someone asks how you are, they expect the brief, upbeat response that keeps social machinery running smoothly, not the authentic sharing that reveals the complexity of your actual experience. When they share something personal, they often expect empathetic acknowledgement rather than the deeper engagement that explores the archetypal patterns underlying their struggle. This mismatch between your depth orientation and others' surface expectations creates a peculiar form of social awkwardness. You must constantly calibrate how much of your authentic self to reveal, how deep to go in responding to others' sharing, how much intensity is appropriate for casual interaction. The social skills that come naturally to surface dwellers, the ability to chat pleasantly about nothing, to maintain cheerful superficiality, to keep things light and entertaining, feel to you like foreign languages you never quite mastered. Your preference for depth extends to your approach to friendship development, while others form instant connections based on shared interests, similar backgrounds, or immediate chemistry. You recognize that true friendship requires time for essence to reveal itself beneath personality, for authentic character to emerge through various life circumstances, for the deeper compatibility of souls to become apparent through sustained interaction. This patient approach to relationship formation often means long periods of apparent social isolation while you wait for the rare soul who can match your depth, who shares your hunger for authentic connection, who brings their own capacity for sustained intimacy to the encounter. You would rather be alone than settle for friendships that require you to edit your authentic self, that force you to pretend satisfaction with superficial exchange, that leave you feeling more isolated than solitude itself. When you do encounter another soul capable of depth relationship, the recognition is often immediate and profound. These meetings feel less like chance encounters and more like spiritual appointments, as though two consciousnesses have been drawn together by forces larger than personal preference or circumstance. The conversation flows with an ease and intensity that surprises both participants, touching depth that neither usually reveals, creating intimacy that typically requires months or years to develop. These soul recognitions cannot be forced or manufactured through conventional relationship-building techniques. They emerge from a quality of authentic presence that most people find either irresistible or terrifying, depending on their own capacity for depth relationship. Your willingness to be genuinely present, to listen without agenda, to respond from your essence rather than your persona, creates space for others to encounter aspects of themselves they rarely access in ordinary social interaction. The relationships that develop from these soul recognitions carry a different quality than conventional friendships. They transcend the usual boundaries of age, background, social status, or shared interests, forming around the deeper compatibility of consciousness itself. These friends become witnesses to your authentic self, companions in consciousness exploration, mirrors that reflect back aspects of your nature that remain invisible in isolation. These depth relationships also serve functions that surface connections cannot provide. They offer the kind of feedback that supports genuine growth, rather than mere validation, challenge your assumptions in ways that expand rather than threaten your identity, provide perspective on your blind spots without undermining your confidence. In the presence of souls who truly see you, you discover aspects of yourself that emerge only in the context of authentic recognition. Your preference for depth over distance extends to romantic relationships, where the challenges become even more complex. In a dating culture oriented around immediate gratification, endless options, and the constant possibility of upgrading to someone better, your need for substantial connection often feels impossibly demanding. The apps and platforms designed to facilitate romantic connection optimize for surface attraction rather than soul compatibility, creating systems that work against the kind of depth relationship you require. Your approach to romantic partnership emphasizes gradual revelation rather than immediate chemistry, long-term compatibility rather than short-term excitement, the capacity to grow together rather than the ability to have fun together. This orientation often puts you at odds with dating culture's emphasis on instant decisions, sexual compatibility assessments, and the market-based approach to relationship that treats partners as commodities to be evaluated and potentially replaced. When you do find romantic partnership capable of matching your depth, the relationship often feels like coming home to yourself in the presence of another. These partnerships transcend the typical dynamics of need-based relating, becoming instead collaborative explorations of consciousness, mutual support for individual growth, shared commitment to purposes larger than personal satisfaction. Your depth orientation also influences your relationship with mentorship and teaching. You naturally gravitate toward learning relationships that prioritize transformation over information transfer, that engage the whole person rather than just the intellectual faculties, that recognize education as awakening rather than accumulation. Similarly, when you find yourself in teaching or mentoring roles, you offer the kind of deep engagement that many people have never experienced in educational contexts. The digital age has created additional challenges for depth-oriented relating. The tools that facilitate connection, email, texting, social media, optimize for frequency and convenience, rather than depth and intimacy. The asynchronous nature of digital communication makes the kind of sustained, real-time exploration that depth relationship requires almost impossible to achieve through electronic means. You find yourself swimming against the current of contemporary relationship culture, which values flexibility over commitment, options over depth, networking over intimacy. Your insistence on substantial connection in an age of superficial interaction makes you appear demanding to some, old-fashioned to others, unrealistic to many who have adapted to the emotional lightweight of contemporary social life. Yet your commitment to depth relationship serves purposes larger than personal satisfaction. In a world increasingly fragmented by surface-level interaction, your capacity for authentic connection becomes a form of cultural preservation, maintaining space for the kind of human encounter that technological convenience tends to eliminate. Your depth relationships become models for others of what becomes possible when souls commit to knowing each other beyond the level of personality and circumstance. The intimacy you create in your closest relationships also generates insights and understanding that benefit the larger community. The depth work you do with individual souls contributes to the collective understanding of human nature, the shared wisdom about consciousness development, the accumulated knowledge about what supports human flourishing. Your preference for intensive over extensive relating becomes a form of research into the possibilities of human connection. Your commitment to depth over distance ultimately reveals itself as service to love itself, not the romanticized emotion, but the transformative force that emerges when souls meet in authentic recognition. By refusing to settle for shallow connection, by maintaining standards for substantial relationship, by offering your own capacity for deep intimacy, you preserve space for love to do its essential work of consciousness evolution. In choosing depth over distance, you participate in the ancient human task of creating meaning through relationship, of discovering truth through intimate encounter, of serving consciousness evolution through the sacred alchemy of souls that have learned to meet each other in the depths where transformation becomes possible. There comes a moment in the soul's journey when the weight of things becomes unbearable, not their physical mass, but their psychic density. You feel it first as a subtle suffocation, a tightening around the heart that speaks of spaces cluttered not merely with objects but with the ghosts of desires unfulfilled and the shadows of identity misplaced. The ancient part of you, the timeless witness that dwells beneath the accumulating layers of modern existence, begins to stir with recognition. It remembers what your generation has forgotten, that to be truly wealthy is to need very little, and to possess everything is to own nothing at all. This is the paradox that lives within you. While others around you chase the endless multiplication of things, you feel drawn toward subtraction, toward the sacred art of letting go. It is not poverty you seek, but richness of an entirely different order. The minimalist's wisdom that moves through you is not born of lack but of abundance, so profound that it transcends the need for external validation through accumulation. You carry within your psyche the memory of ancient monasteries, where monks discovered that the fewer possessions they owned, the more possession they had of themselves. Jung spoke of enantiodromia, the tendency of things to turn into their opposite when taken to extremes. In a culture drunk on acquisition, your soul naturally swings toward its psychological opposite, finding in simplicity what others seek in complexity, discovering in emptiness what they pursue through fullness. This is not rebellion but restoration, not rejection but remembering. Your minimalist impulse emerges from the deepest layers of the collective unconscious, where wisdom traditions stretching back millennia whisper their secrets about the relationship between having and being. Watch how your contemporaries move through the world, their arms full of packages, their minds cluttered with the catalogue of things they believe they need. There is a frantic quality to their acquisition, a desperate gathering that speaks of a hunger no object can satisfy. They mistake the container for the contents, the symbol for the reality it points toward. A designer handbag becomes identity, a luxury car transforms into self-worth, a house filled with expensive furniture masquerades as home. But you, ancient soul that you are, see through this collective hallucination to the emptiness that drives it. The consumer culture that surrounds you operates on a profound misunderstanding of human nature. It assumes that the self is built through accumulation, that identity can be purchased, that meaning can be manufactured and delivered to your door in attractive packaging. But your old soul knows better. It remembers that the self, Jung's self, with a capital S, the archetypal center of psychological wholeness, cannot be bought or sold. It can only be discovered, uncovered, revealed through the patient work of removing what is not essential, what does not truly belong. This is why material accumulation feels like spiritual suffocation to you. Each unnecessary object you bring into your space carries with it not just physical weight, but psychic density. It demands attention, maintenance, organization. It clutters not just your environment, but your consciousness. The ancient wisdom keepers understood this intimately. They knew that outer simplicity creates inner spaciousness, that by reducing the complexity of their external world, they could attend more fully to the vast complexity of their inner landscape. Your minimalist tendencies are not aesthetic preferences, but expressions of psychological health. When Jung analyzed the dreams and fantasies of his patients, he often found symbols of clearing, cleaning, simplification, the psyche's natural movement toward what he called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you truly are beneath all the accumulated layers of conditioning and false identification. Your impulse to own less is your psyche's wisdom in action, creating space for this essential work of self-discovery. Consider the metaphor of the chrysalis. Before the butterfly can emerge, the caterpillar must dissolve into an undifferentiated mass, letting go of its previous form entirely. There is a necessary destruction, a sacred emptying that precedes all authentic transformation. Your generation, terrified of this dissolution, tries to avoid it through accumulation, as if by gathering enough things around themselves, they could prevent the ego's necessary death and rebirth. But you feel the call to voluntary dissolution, understanding instinctively that letting go is not loss, but liberation. The objects that surround most people are not neutral. They carry projections, unconscious contents of the psyche that have been split off and attached to external things. A person might project their sense of security onto their possessions, their creativity onto their art supplies they never use, their potential for adventure onto the camping gear gathering dust in their garage. These projections create psychological entanglements, invisible chains that bind the soul to the material world in ways that prevent authentic engagement with life. Your minimalist wisdom recognizes these projections and refuses to be ensnared by them. Instead of projecting your security onto the size of your bank account or the number of your possessions, you learn to find security in your capacity to adapt, to be present, to draw from the inexhaustible well of inner resources. Instead of projecting your creativity onto tools and supplies, you discover creativity as a way of being, an approach to existence that requires nothing more than consciousness itself. This is perhaps the most radical aspect of your minimalist understanding, the recognition that everything you need you already have, not in the naive sense that ignores genuine material needs, but in the profound recognition that the essential qualities that make life meaningful, love, creativity, wisdom, peace, joy, cannot be purchased or accumulated. They arise naturally when the conditions are right, and one of the primary conditions is space, physical space, mental space, emotional space, spiritual space. The ancient Taoists spoke of the usefulness of emptiness, how it is the empty space within a cup that makes it functional, the hollow of a wheel's hub that allows it to turn, the vacant space within a house that makes it livable. Your minimalist consciousness grasps this essential truth about emptiness as potential, as the fertile void from which all creativity emerges. While others fill every space with things, you learn to honor emptiness as sacred, as the pregnant darkness from which new life is born. There is also profound ecological wisdom in your minimalist approach, though this wisdom extends far beyond environmental concerns into the realm of psychic ecology. Just as the earth suffers under the weight of overconsumption, the psyche suffers under the burden of psychological overconsumption. Too many choices, too many stimuli, too many demands for attention and energy. Your instinct for simplicity creates a more sustainable relationship, not just with the planet, but with your own finite psychological resources. The minimalist path is ultimately a path of discrimination, the cultivation of wisdom that can distinguish between what is essential and what is superfluous, what nourishes the soul and what merely feeds the ego's endless appetite for more. This discrimination is not harsh or judgmental, but gentle and wise, like a gardener who knows which plants serve the garden's overall health, and which are weeds that must be removed not out of hatred but out of love for what wants to flourish. Watch what happens when you practice this discrimination in your daily life. Notice how choosing to own fewer clothes but love the ones you have creates a different relationship with self-expression. Observe how having fewer books but reading them more deeply changes your relationship with knowledge. Feel how cooking simple meals with attention and gratitude transforms the act of eating from consumption to communion. In each case, less becomes more through the alchemy of consciousness. Your contemporaries often mistake your minimalist choices for deprivation, but you know the opposite is true. By saying no to the unnecessary, you create space to say yes to the essential, with complete presence. By refusing to scatter your attention across 1,000 possessions, you can focus it like a laser beam on what truly matters. This focused attention is itself a form of wealth that no amount of money can buy, the wealth of presence, of being fully here with whatever is. The minimalist wisdom that flows through you is also deeply connected to the archetype of the monk, the hermit, the sage. Those figures who throughout history have understood that wisdom increases in inverse proportion to possessions. These archetypal energies live within the collective unconscious, and your connection to them explains why minimalist practices feel so natural, so homecoming-like to your ancient soul. You are not inventing a new way of being, but remembering an old one, allowing these timeless patterns to express themselves through your modern life. There is also a profound relationship between minimalism and the experience of beauty. When your environment is not cluttered with the mediocre, when your attention is not scattered across countless objects, you become capable of experiencing true beauty with an intensity that consumption culture makes nearly impossible. A single flower in a clean, empty room can become a doorway to the divine. A piece of music heard in stillness can transport you to realms that no amount of entertainment can reach. This is the aesthetic dimension of minimalist wisdom, the understanding that beauty reveals itself most fully in spaciousness. The journey toward minimalist wisdom is not always easy. It requires you to face the fears that drive accumulation, fear of scarcity, fear of not having enough, fear of being nobody without the external markers of identity. These fears are not personal, but collective, inherited from generations of ancestors who experienced real scarcity, real danger, real need. Your minimalist path requires healing these ancestral wounds, developing trust that the universe will provide what is needed when it is needed. It also requires you to distinguish between minimalism as ego strategy and minimalism as soul wisdom. The ego can co-opt any practice, including minimalism, turning it into another way to feel superior, another identity to defend, another set of rules to follow rigidly. True minimalist wisdom is flexible, responsive, alive. It knows when to acquire and when to release, when to say yes and when to say no. It serves life, not ideology. As you continue to practice this ancient art of voluntary simplicity, you begin to discover that having less allows you to be more present, more creative, more generous, more yourself. The energy that others spend managing, organizing, and maintaining their possessions becomes available for the real work of being human, loving, creating, serving, growing, exploring the infinite depths of consciousness itself. Your minimalist wisdom is ultimately about freedom. Freedom from the tyranny of things, freedom from the endless cycle of desire and acquisition, freedom from the illusion that external accumulation can solve internal emptiness. This freedom is not the absence of choice, but the presence of right choice, the capacity to discern what serves your authentic nature and what merely feeds the false self that consumer culture creates. In a world obsessed with addition, you practice subtraction. In a culture of more, you embody enough. In a society of accumulation, you demonstrate the profound abundance that emerges when we stop trying to fill the unfillable and start honoring the fullness that is always already here. Your minimalist wisdom is not just a personal practice, but a gift to a world that has forgotten the difference between having everything and being everything. The ancient alchemists spoke of the process of solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate, break down and rebuild. Your minimalist path is a living expression of this eternal process, dissolving the accumulated layers of unnecessary stuff to reveal the essential self that has always been there waiting beneath the clutter. In letting go of what you don't need, you discover what you have always had. In owning less, you possess more. In embracing emptiness, you touch the fullness that no accumulation can match. This is the minimalist's wisdom, not the poverty of having too little, but the wealth of needing nothing more than what is. It is the recognition that true abundance is not about the multiplication of possessions, but the quality of presence, not about having more but being more, not about accumulating wealth, but about realizing that you are wealth itself, needing nothing to be complete, whole and infinitely rich in the only currency that truly matters, consciousness itself, aware of its own inexhaustible nature. As you walk this path of voluntary simplicity, you become a living demonstration of this ancient truth. In a world drunk on acquisition, your contentment with less becomes a form of prophecy, a glimpse of a different way of being that others will eventually remember as their own souls grow tired of the endless chase after more. You are not better than them. You are simply remembering what they have temporarily forgotten, holding the space for their eventual awakening to the minimalist wisdom that lives within every human heart, waiting for the right moment to emerge from beneath the accumulated layers of collective amnesia about what it truly means to be wealthy. There exists within you a sacred rebellion, not the crude revolt of adolescence that seeks to tear down without understanding, but the profound questioning of an ancient soul that refuses to accept inherited lies, simply